Behind the quiet history of state-run institutions, where granite walls promised sanctuary and treatment, lies a terror far colder than any fever dream. It is the terror of the ledger, the cruelty of calculation. We often look for the madman, the sadist, the individual monster, but sometimes the greatest atrocities are committed not by fury, but by icy, methodical efficiency. Sealed medical records, finally released in 2018 from the old state archives in Augusta, Maine, revealed a truth deliberately buried for over a century. A truth concerning 317 patients, mostly young men and women, admitted to the Kennebec Psychiatric Asylum, an institution known locally as the Iron Coast for its desolate location, its unrelenting exposure to the North Atlantic winds, and the chilling finality of its restraints. Each file contained the same disturbing pattern. After an average stay of only 18 months, these patients, diagnosed with conditions ranging from melancholy to moral imbecility, were classified with the stark, heartless designation, irretrievably cost-ineffective. The records then documented a rapid, almost clinical decline, prescribed dietary changes that were, in reality, starvation protocols, the introduction of a potent drug cocktail known only in the ledgers as the quiet sleep, and finally, a notation, devoid of empathy, yet rich in meaning, disposed, per Protocol 7. What makes these medical files particularly disturbing is not the suffering they endured, but the systematic, business-like logic behind their elimination. This was not a random act of neglect, it was an industry. The architects of this protocol left behind detailed ledgers, complex cost-benefit analyses, and copious, prideful correspondence with similar state-run facilities across the Northeast, as far south as Pennsylvania and as far west as Michigan. Before we continue with the story of the Kennebec Asylum and the carefully calculated horror that unfolded within its massive stone walls, try to grasp the weight of the central idea. What you are about to hear was not the work of a single sadistic doctor, but a lucrative institutional business model shared among state officials and administrators obsessed not with healing, but with maximizing taxpayer dollars at the expense of human life. If you are listening from Maine, Massachusetts, or anywhere in New England, and you have ever felt the shadow of history over your oldest hospitals or institutions, leave a comment telling us your state or city. Your perspective on this dark chapter of institutional history matters, reminding us that vulnerability is not a crime, and care should not be a calculation. And please subscribe to Shadow Tales, because stories like this need to be remembered, not buried. The apex of efficiency and the weight of silence. Kennebec, Itembabe Tishaba. The systematic nature of what happened at Kennebec forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about post-Civil War public funding, one that goes beyond already inhumane asylum conditions into territory most historians prefer to discuss only in clinical, financial terms. Kennebec County in 1878 represented the industrial apex of the Iron Coast. Mills, timber, and shipbuilding fueled an economy dependent on healthy, productive labor. The state of Maine's obligation to the indigent, the criminal, and the insane was constantly scrutinized for efficiency. The Kennebec Psychiatric Asylum, established in 1860, sprawled across 80 isolated acres on a windswept bluff overlooking the bay. The main building, a grim, four-story granite structure with barred Gothic windows, stood as a monument to the state's cold authority. By the late 1872, Kennebec was administered by Dr. Elias Thorne, a 52-year-old physician whose reputation was built on his mastery of the budget, not medicine. Unlike many asylum superintendents who focused on experimental therapies, Dr. Thorne maintained meticulous control over every expenditure. He kept detailed, daily records, corresponded with legislative committees on fiscal responsibility, and proudly served on the state's Board of Charities. His peers considered him a model of efficiency and rigorous cost control. The asylum's patient population numbered 450 souls in 1878. Unlike neighboring state facilities that struggled with constant overflow and rising supply costs, Kennebec appeared remarkably stable and boasted a significantly lower per-patient operational cost than the national average. Dr. Thorne's reputation for sound management of his human charges was discussed at legislative hearings and budget meetings as something to be emulated. What made this reputation particularly significant was the asylum's unusual cost savings. While other institutions struggled with the economics of long-term, chronic care, Kennebec seemed to maintain its stability by constantly cycling its population at a rate that defied actuarial standards for long-term residency. The asylum's physical layout reflected traditional institutional architecture, but with a specific, sinister modification. The front administration wing and patient workshops were visible and functional, but it was the West Wing infirmary, built into the rear and shielded by high stone walls, that distinguished Kennebec. Dr. Thorne had renovated these wards in 1873, ostensibly for the violently psychotic, yet the true purpose was economic. No one questioned why the infirmary required a separate, guarded entrance, or why its wards were built with walls 3 feet thick, insulated to prevent sound or life from escaping. The patients at Kennebec lived under a regime that was orderly, which ironically generated its own form of control. The food was just adequate, the work structured. The threat of transfer to the West Wing Infirmary, the place where patients went to be forgotten, hung over anyone who questioned or resisted. Yet, certain patterns were visible to those who cared to look. New admissions, especially those without wealth or family who came in under state commitment, disappeared from the main wards with chilling predictability. The official explanation was always a transfer to specialized care. They would vanish, and a few months later, their files would simply be archived with a quiet note, veiled treatment protocol and permanent care registry. The cold logic of Protocol 7. Silas Crane's descent. Silas Crane arrived at Kennebec in May 1878. He was a survivor of a shipwreck, committed after the acute grief of losing his wife and child left him paralyzed by acute melancholy. At 21, he was healthy, literate, and, most importantly for Dr. Thorne, he had no surviving family to inquire after him. He expected rest, perhaps even compassion. He received neither. He was assigned to the bookbindery, a quiet workshop. It was there he found a fragile, temporary peace, repairing worn state volumes. Then, on a cold evening in late October, the chief orderly, Mr. Rourke, a man whose face held the expression of perpetually bored fatigue, came for him. "Dr. Thorne requires your presence in the West Wing. Bring nothing. Come with me now." The urgency in Rourke's voice, the way his hand gripped the lamp, terrified Silas more than any shouting. He was led through the main house, past the kitchens that smelled faintly of boiling cabbage, and then outside, to the separate, imposing entrance of the infirmary. It was a heavy, bolted steel door set into the granite. Rourke's key turned with a deafening, metallic clack. The air that rushed up from the ramp below was instantly chilling. It carried a strange, medicinal scent, mixed with something organic, something sickly sweet, and damp the smell of stone, shadow, and sickness. Silas stumbled down the ramp and through a second, heavy door. The corridor was low, forcing him to duck, and lit by gas lamps in wire cages, casting long, wavering shadows. The walls were thick, perfectly laid granite, absorbing all sound. He was led into a large, square chamber. The first thing he noticed was the furniture. A long stainless steel table in the center, glinting under the gaslight, and shelves lined not with books, but with chemical bottles, glass jars, and perfectly aligned file boxes. Dr. Thorne stood by a small desk, his clean hands meticulously turning the page of a massive, leather-bound ledger. "Silas Crane," Dr. Thorne said, his voice flat, devoid of passion. "You come with excellent references regarding your ability to follow instruction and your limited family connection. What you are about to learn is the source of Kennebec's enviable financial standing. You will cooperate fully, or you will be transferred to the state penitentiary ward, where I understand the treatment for insubordination is quite persuasive." Silas stood frozen. He saw 4 other patients, 2 men, 2 women standing silently near the wall in thin gowns. One of the women, a young Irish girl named Molly, who he'd seen crying quietly in the dining hall, had a face that was completely blank, empty of expression. "Good," Thorne continued. "Mr. Rourke here is about to finalize the disposition of subject 244 for Kennebec. You will observe. This will be your introduction to your new primary duty. Over the next few excruciating hours, Silas was initiated into the terrible truth. The asylum was not a place of healing. It was an economic clearinghouse. Patients were selected based on youth, lack of family connection, a terminal diagnosis, and the simple, damning calculation, cost of care versus potential for discharge. If a patient was projected to live for decades but never be productive or discharged, they were a financial cancer on the budget. Dr. Thorne explained it all with the monotonous tone of an accountant. A chronically ill patient can cost the state $200 annually for 40 years. That is $8,000 in liability. But a clean, efficient termination and an immediate transfer of their file to the permanent disposition archive leaves that slot open for a fee-paying patient or reduces our operating expenditure immediately. Insanity wears out the budget, Silas. But this is fiscal responsibility. He gestured to his ledger, his euthanasia ledger. We are, in essence, creating an entirely new model of state-sponsored healthcare management. Silas's role became the most terrible form of bookkeeping. His literacy made him valuable for maintaining the ledgers, documenting the cost savings, and rewriting patient files to reflect failed treatment protocols. His health and relative strength were needed to assist Rourke with the disposition of assets, the body bags, the unrecorded burials. He was told, coldly, that if he faltered, he would immediately become Subject 120. The greatest emotional horror was realizing that to save his own life, he had to participate in ending others. He had to become one of the shadows in the cold light of the infirmary. The weight of the names and the fight for dignity. Silas found himself working alongside the other forced orderlies, the silent patients whose records had also deemed them fiscally expendable, but were being temporarily used for their strength and literacy. The young girl, Molly, was assigned to cleaning the linens after the disposals. He never heard her speak. Her face, perpetually pale, seemed to have learned how to hold all the grief of the room without letting it spill. They communicated not through words, but through shared, horrifying knowledge, a glance toward the table, a shuddering breath that couldn't be held back. In the quiet hours of the infirmary, as Silas logged the final expenses of the latest victim, an elderly man who only spoke of his life before the war, he began a silent act of resistance. He maintained Dr. Thorne's records perfectly. But in the margins, using a pencil so light it was almost invisible, he added details that quantified the human loss. Next to Subject 168, disposition complete. Liability, $7,400. Silas would sketch a tiny, almost imperceptible icon, a ship, a fishing net, a flower, a small memory, or characteristic he had gleaned from the patient's original, discarded file. This was his private prayer, his silent scream. You were more than a number. The victims were not just anonymous bodies. They were a schoolteacher who had loved to sketch birds, a young lumberjack who had lost his leg and his mind to gangrene, a quiet mother diagnosed with hysteria whose only crime was weeping too much. Silas saw their lives reduced to a financial entry, and his act of resistance was to restore their dignity, one tiny, hidden notation at a time. The system's relentless efficiency was breaking him, but this secret ledger, unseen beneath the professional script, was saving his soul. He learned that the only way to survive the crushing weight of the system was to keep a part of his mind, a part of his heart absolutely free, documenting the truth the ledger tried to erase. Dr. Thorne's expansion of the system continued through the 1,880 seconds. By 1886, he was operating what amounted to a perfect, industrial-scale asylum model. The West Wing Infirmary had been expanded twice, now including 4 specialized disposition chambers and an enlarged archive for the permanent disposition records. His reputation as a successful administrator spread throughout the state. Visitors would tour the main wards, the impressive workshops, and the immaculate financial books, and express admiration for the system's efficiency. The moral dimensions of what they were witnessing seemed not to occur to them, or if they did, were dismissed as sentimentality inappropriate to business considerations. The legacy of the quiet sleep. The suppression of the truth might have been the end of the story, but the sheer volume of permanent dispositions eventually drew attention. A young, idealistic legislative aide in Boston, compiling comparative cost data for a new asylum, noticed Kennebeck's impossibly low long-term care figures. He noticed the pattern. Patients, particularly young ones, classified as chronic liability, vanishing. His inquiries were met with administrative stonewalling. The official lie was simple. They were transferred to private care, per their families' wishes. But the aide dug deeper. The breakthrough came decades later. The final testimony, sealed in 1893, was finally released 73 years later, in 1962, as part of a legislative review into institutional abuse that accompanied growing civil rights and medical ethics movements. By then, only one person who had worked at Kennebeck's West Wing remained alive, a retired junior accountant named Malcolm Howe, who had handled the fiscal side of the archives in the early 1900s. This accountant, in a recorded interview in 1963, a year before his death, spoke of the cold, undeniable truth buried in the figures. They weren't murdering people, not in their minds. They were eliminating debt. The asylum was viewed as a business, and those who didn't contribute or couldn't be cured were simply seen as negative capital. Thorne's meticulous records and the Protocol 7 designation were just the bureaucratic instruments of a state budget obsessed with zero-sum results. The real monster wasn't a doctor, it was the balance sheet. Silas Crane's fate remains cloudy. His own file was finally marked disposed in 1889. Did he finally succumb to the weight of his duties? Did he resist and become Protocol 7? We don't know. But when researchers examined the surviving fragments of Dr. Thorne's ledgers, the documents that survived the subsequent investigation, they found the tiny, nearly erased pencil marks in the margins. The ships, the flowers, the faces. Silas's desperate act of humanity had preserved the one thing the system sought to destroy: the memory of who they were. The euthanasia ledgers of the Iron Coast, the fragments of which survived and were finally opened to researchers, provided crucial evidence for understanding how systematic the exploitation of the institutionalized had become. The women and men who perished in Kennebeck's West Wing deserved more than the clinical notation in a ledger or the brief mentions in financial reports. They deserved to have their names spoken, their silence broken, their lives valued. This story matters because it reveals the logic of treating human life as a monetary liability carried to its rational conclusion. Dr. Thorne wasn't a monster, apart from his state. He was a respected civil servant, applying techniques of corporate efficiency to human beings because his legal and social system told him that some lives were simply not worth the cost. The survivors of this system, and the descendants who still search for the truth of their lost relatives, carry forward that insistence on dignity and human value. The basement complex at Kennebeck was torn down in the 1,970 seconds. Today, the site is a public park. The horror is gone, but the lesson remains. Never mistake efficiency for morality. Never let a life be reduced to a number on a ledger. What do you think about this dark chapter of institutional history? How should we remember the hundreds of patients deemed irretrievably cost-ineffective? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you or made you think differently about the history of American institutions, please like this video and share it with others who need to hear these voices from the past. Subscribe to Shadow Tales for more stories that history tried to bury. These voices deserve to be heard, and these stories need to be told. See you in the next video.